Chapter 13 of the Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 13. To fight his friends. Poor Jack Rogers. His lot was indeed a hard one. We left him clinging to the keel of the schooner while she was carried on by the rapid current over the bar, amidst the raging waters and the blinding foam. Every moment he expected to be torn from his hold, but life was dear to him, and he exerted every particle of strength he possessed to hold on. Now a sea would come and wash over the vessel, almost drowning him, and completely preventing him from seeing. Then he felt that he was whirled round and round, till he looked up, but it was only to see another huge breaker rolling up ready to overwhelm him. He felt the terrible dash of the wave. Its roar sounded in his ears. He was almost stunned. He prayed that he might be preserved from the terrible danger to which he was exposed. The roller passed on, leaving him still firmly clutching the wreck. Again he looked up. The blue sea danced cheerfully before his eyes. The sun shone brightly. The wreck had drifted clear of the influence of the breakers. More grateful he felt at having been thus far preserved. Still he knew that he was not out of danger. The schooner might at any moment go down, and he might be left, without a plank to rest on, to the mercy of the ravenous sharks which swarmed around. His first impulse was to look out for the brig. She was in the offing, standing away to the westward. He had no hope from any help she could render him. Then he distanced from it. He calculated the distance, and thought to himself that he could swim on shore. If he delayed, the vessel might drift farther out to sea, and the feat might be impossible. The sooner it is done, the better, he thought to himself. I have swum as far in a worse sea before now. Before slipping off into the water, he commended himself with a hearty prayer to the care of a merciful Providence. He was on the very point of letting go his hold, when as he looked into the water, his eye fell on a dark triangular object just rising out of it, slowly moving past. He looked again with a shudder, for he recognized the fin of another shark. Another and another passed by. Truly thankful did he feel that he had not trusted himself voluntarily within the power of their voracious jaws. If the vessel sank, though, where would he be? He could not help thinking of that. He got up and gazed round. He was beginning to feel very hungry, and to his other dangers the risk of starvation was now added. Still he did not allow himself to despair. He hoped that his old schoolfellows and Hemming would soon recross the bar, and seeing the wreck, come and find him. After a little time, as he was casting his eye to the southward, he thought he saw a dark object moving along close inshore, just outside the surf. He soon made out that it was a canoe, and then that she was manned by blacks. As they drew near, it was evident that they saw him on the wreck, for they at once pulled towards him. He scarcely knew whether to hail them as friends or foes. They were very ill-looking fellows, he thought. There were also two white men in the stern sheets of the canoe. He did not like their looks at all either. They were soon alongside, and when they saw his uniform, they looked up at him with no very friendly eye. He hoped that his old schoolfellows and Hemming would soon recross the bar, and seeing the wreck, come and find him. After a little time, as he was casting his eye to the southward, he thought he saw a dark object moving along close inshore, just outside the surf. He soon made out that it was a canoe, and then that she was manned by blacks. As they drew near, it was evident that they saw him on the wreck, for they at once pulled towards him. He scarcely knew whether to hail them as friends or foes. They were very ill-looking fellows, he thought. They were also two white men in the stern sheets of the canoe. He did not like their looks at all either. They were soon alongside, and when they saw his uniform, they looked up at him with no very friendly eye. Having held a short parley amongst themselves, they hailed him, but what they said he could not make out. Dangerous as his present position was, he felt no inclination to entrust himself to their care. However, they made signs to him to come down into the canoe, and after a little reflection, and thinking it better not to show any fear or mistrust of them, he complied with their demands, and as he slid down over the side of the vessel, they caught him and hauled him in. He saw them minutely examining the vessel, and then they asked him a number of questions in Spanish, or a sort of mongrel Spanish, which he could not clearly comprehend, and he thought it more prudent not to show that he understood them at all. He made out, however, that the strangers were inquiring how the vessel was capsized, and how he came to be on board her. He guessed also that they knew that she was a slaver, and had been captured by the party to which he had belonged. When they found that he did not reply to their questions, they let him sit down at the bottom of the canoe, while the two whites and one of the black men talked together among themselves. They every now and then cast glances ominous of evil intentions towards him. Poor Jack did not at all like their looks, still less the tenor of the few words whose meanings he caught. "Knock him on the head at once," said one. "Throw him overboard, and let the sharks have him," proposed another. "Shoot him with pistol," quoted the big negro, grinning horribly. These words were uttered with the most cold-blooded indifference, as if the act proposed by the speakers was one of everyday occurrence with them. Jack, as he listened, longed to make an effort to save his life. Anything was better than to sit there quietly and be murdered. Far rather would he die struggling bravely for existence. Still, as the pirates did not make any further demonstration, he thought it would be wiser to appear unconscious of their threats, and remain where he was without moving. Jack, however, now and then looked over the gunwale of the canoe, to ascertain where they were going. They quickly arrived off the bar, but the slave dealers or pirates, or whatever they were, seemed to think that there was too much surf to allow them to cross it. They therefore pulled back a little way to the south. Jack observed a patch of sandy beach, with a clear channel up to it, between two rocks. They waited for a short time, and then the canoe, mounting on the top of a roller, was carried rapidly forward, the foam hissing and bubbling around her, till she grounded on the beach. In a moment the crew, jumping out of her, ran her up out of the reach of the succeeding roller, which roared angrily, as if disappointed of its prey. Jack was going to walk on, but he felt a hand laid heavily on his shoulder, and his arms, being seized by two of the black fellows, were bound behind him, and he found himself a prisoner on the coast of Africa, without the slightest prospect, as far as he could see, of making his escape from his ruffian captors. Poor Jack was dragged along by his savage companions, the muzzle of a pistol or the point of a long knife every now and then being shown him, as a hint that he might keep up his spirits and move on. This was no easy matter without stumbling, for the ground was strewed with decayed timber, while creepers and parasitical plants of numerous species formed traps to catch his feet. He saw, too, the grass frequently moving, as a hideous snake or some other reptile crept away among it. Overhead were birds of every variety and of the richest plumage, parrots, trumpet birds, pigeons, whydahs, green paroquets, and numberless others, which he was in no humour just then to admire, while monkeys of all sorts skipped about among the boughs of the lofty palms, and chattered away, as if to inquire where the stranger had come from. In one or two openings between the giant palms, bananas, and other lofty trees, Jack caught sight of some blue ranges of mountains in the far distance, and towards them, as they pushed their way through the dense underwood, his captors seemed to be proceeding. The dreadful thought occurred to him that he was being carried off into the interior to be turned into a slave, and perhaps that he should never be able to make his escape. The jungle grew thicker and thicker, and the forest more gloomy as they proceeded, till he could scarcely work his way along, and even the Spaniards and blacks, with their arms at liberty, had no little difficulty in making progress through it. At last they came to a standstill, and a talk among themselves. Poor Jack caught the very ominous words, "Mata el chico," which he knew too well meant, "kill the little chap." "He is not worth the trouble he costs us," added a ferocious Spaniard, who had spoken. "This knife of mine will settle him with a blow." "It is a pity we did not do it in the canoe, and save ourselves trouble," growled out his companion, drawing his long knife from his belt. Jack felt that his last moments had come. He, however, eyed his captors boldly, and tried to nerve himself for the expected stroke. A short time before, some villains of the same character as those into whose power he had fallen had murdered a young midshipman, whom they had found on board a prize they had retaken, and he knew that they would have no scruples about killing him. The blacks stood by, enjoying apparently his agony, for brave as he was, it was a bitter thing thus, without cause, to be cruelly murdered in cold blood. No one spoke. Jack tried to offer up a prayer to heaven, but, at such a moment, even to pray was difficult. His heart, though, was praying, and one who knows what it is in the heart heard him. Suddenly there was a rustling of leaves, a crashing of boughs. A loud shriek was uttered, and a huge animal leaped through the brushwood, and, seizing one of the negroes, again bounded off into the thicket. The unfortunate wretch cried out piteously for help. The Spaniards and the negroes turned to pursue the wild beast. From the glimpse Jack had of it, he believed it to be a tiger. The negro who had been seized was the smallest of the party, and of light weight, and the savage brute was more accustomed to make his way through the tangled underwood than were his pursuers. On he went, bounding through the thicket, his miserable victim in vain crying for assistance. The rest pursued as fast as they could, apparently forgetting Jack altogether. They were soon hid from his sight by the trees. He had no wish to follow them, even had he possessed the power of so doing. His arms were bound, and before he could do anything he must contrive to get them loose. He tugged and tugged away frantically. He was afraid his captors would be back before he could get free, and execute their murderous threats. By what means was he to escape? He could not just then tell. The first thing was to obtain the use of his limbs. He worked away for life and death. At last he twisted the rope round so that he could reach one of the knots with his teeth. He pulled away lustily. He found that he was slackening it. He listened for the shouts and cries of the pirates. He thought that their voices sounded louder and nearer again. He was every moment getting the ropes looser. One more tug, and his hands were at liberty. He struck out on either side to assure himself that he had the free use of them. He looked around. No one was in sight. His first impulse was to set off and run back to the coast, but then he recollected that he might be easily pursued, that it must be 7 or 8 miles off at least, as 3 or 4 hours had passed since he and his captors had left it. After a moment's reflection he determined to find his way as soon as possible to the banks of the river. He was certain that the boats would be sent in to look for his party, and, by watching for them, he hoped to be able to make some signal to call their attention to himself. He still heard the voices of the pirates. A tall palm tree was near. He thought that the safest place would be to get to the top of it. He could easily hide himself among the wide-spreading leaves, and the Spaniards, believing his arms were bound, would never think of looking there for him. He would also have the advantage of watching all that was going on below. He had seen blacks climb a tree with a band partly round their stem and partly around their waists. The rope he had just got clear of his arms would help him up in the same way. He rapidly fitted it, and, with knees and hands working away, up he went the smooth stem. He had just got nearly to the top when he heard a chattering, and looking up he saw a very ugly face grinning down upon him. An ape had previous possession of his proposed stronghold. He was not to be daunted, however, but, swinging himself up on the bough, prepared to do battle for its possession. He had still the pistol in his belt, though it was not loaded. The pirates had forgotten to deprive him of it. He held it by the muzzle, and Master Quacko, who seemed to be a very sensible monkey, thought it would be foolish to pick a quarrel with so well armed a stranger. As Jack advanced, he retreated, till Jack reached the centre of the tree, where he could coil himself away without the possibility of anyone below discovering him. He looked round before sitting down. Below him was a dense mass of foliage, with only here and there an opening. To the west, in the far distance, was the sea, looking bright and blue. To the east were ranges of mountains, the most remote evidently of considerable elevation, while to the north he caught a glimpse of the river. To his great satisfaction, not very far off, he could still hear the voices of the pirates, but he could not discover whether they had succeeded in rescuing the wretched negro from the fangs of the tiger. Meantime the monkey sat on the farther end of a branch watching him. "I hope you have formed a favourable opinion of me, Master Quacko," he said, looking at the ape, for even in the dangerous predicament in which he was placed he could not resist a joke. "Quacko, Quacko, Quacko," went the monkey, in a tone which Jack thought was friendly. He felt about in his pocket and found a piece of biscuit. He nibbled a bit, and then held it out to his companion. The ape drew near, at first hesitatingly. Jack nibbled a little more of the biscuit. Quacko thought it would be all gone if he did not make haste, so he made 1 or 2 more hops up towards Jack. Jack nibbled away, then once more held out the biscuit. The monkey made one spring and nearly caught it, but Jack drew it back, that the animal might feel that it was given to him. Then he held it out, and the ape took it quite gently, but ran off to the end of the bough, that he might examine this new sort of food, and eat it at his leisure. The pirates had now found their way back to where they had left Jack. He could plainly hear them asking one another what could have become of him. They were under the tree in which he lay so snugly ensconced. "He must have hid himself in the brushwood. He cannot be far off," said one. "If he had had his hands at liberty, I should say he would have got up one of these trees," observed another. "Those English sailors can climb anything. I have seen them go up the side of a slippery rock without a hole in which to stick their nails." "He cannot be up this tree," remarked the first. "See, there is a monkey quietly eating a nut on one of the branches. There is no other tree near in which he could hide." After this the men hunted about on every side, and Jack hoped that they would then go away. "He must still be near," exclaimed one of them. "Sancho, do you climb that tree and look about you. You will soon find out where he is by the shaking of the bushes as he moves along. Up, man, up!" Jack knew by the voice which replied that one of the negroes was climbing up. The monkey had finished his biscuit, and, liking it very much, came back for some more, not observing what was occurring below. Jack had won his confidence, and by giving him a very little bit at a time kept the animal close to him. Up climbed the black. Jack knew that he could knock him down again with the butt end of his pistol, but if he did he would only hasten his own destruction, as the others would quickly find means to get hold of him. He felt that the black was close under him. He caught the sight of his woolly pate working its way through the leaves. Now or never, thought Jack. He seized the unsuspecting ape and threw him down directly on the negro's head. The monkey, as much astonished as anybody, laid hold of the woolly crop with his claws, and scratched and bit, chattering away with all his might. "Fetish, fetish, fetish!" screamed out the negro, sliding down the tree a great deal faster than he had come up, coming down the latter part of the run, and reaching the ground more dead than alive, while the monkey clambered up again, and, not daring to approach Jack, took his seat at the end of a bough, chattering away in the greatest state of agitation. Jack lay snug. He had hopes that none of the other blacks would attempt to climb the tree after the reception their companion had met with, and from what he heard them say he had great hopes that they really believed that they had seen a fetish. The Spaniards, too, though pretending to laugh at the superstition of the negroes, having no religion of their own to supply its place, were very strongly impressed with the black man's superstition, and would on no account have attempted to climb up the tree. Jack therefore began to hope that he should escape from his intending murderers, and he did not despair of ultimately getting back to his ship. In a short time the Spaniards and negroes, uttering loud oaths at their ill luck in having lost one of their companions as well as their captive, set off once more, and Jack watched them as they worked their way through the brushwood to the eastward. He felt truly glad when they were no longer to be seen. He was now also in a hurry to be off. "Good-bye, Mr. Quacko," said he, turning to the monkey and making him a profound bow, for Jack was the pink of politeness. "I am very much obliged to you for the accommodation your tree has afforded me, and for the assistance you have rendered me, and if you will ever venture afloat I shall be very happy to see you on board our ship. Good-bye, old fellow, give us a paw." He felt in a curiously excited state, and ready to talk any nonsense. Quacko, who thought he was to have some more biscuit, came near, but when he saw that there was none he hopped off again and chattered away louder than ever. Jack now descended in the same way that he had got up. His first care was to cut a thick stick to serve as a weapon of defence, for he thought to himself, "If the tigers about here are so bold as to carry off a black man, they are just as likely to attack me." He accordingly kept his eyes about him, and, steering as well as he could by the sun, he pushed away towards the north. He could not help expecting to see a tiger spring out towards him, and every now and then he was startled by a snake crawling across his path, while the cawing of the parrots and parakeets and the chattering of monkeys made him feel like one of those knights in fairy stories, who have to traverse a forest haunted by evil spirits, who do their utmost to turn him from his gallant purpose of rescuing a lovely princess from the enchanted castle in which she had been shut up. Jack, however, was not to be turned from his intention of getting down to the banks of the river. He forgot that he would have to cross through a mangrove swamp, unless he could hit upon one of the few paths used by the negroes for the purpose of crossing it. Night was now rapidly approaching. He saw that unless he would run a very great risk of serving as the supper of some hungry wild beast, he must get up into a tree and pass it there. He was getting very hungry also, and he had but a few scraps of the biscuit he had shared with the monkey. Still, as long as there was daylight, he was anxious to push on, for he was sure that the boats would be sent in to look for him the first thing in the morning, and he wanted to be near the river to signalize to them. So he pushed on, beating down the bushes with his thick stick. Many a snake, lizard, and other creeping or crawling things hissed or croaked at him as he passed. At last he saw before him an open space. "Ah, now at all events I shall be able to push on rapidly," he thought to himself. So he did, and went on some way, when on a sudden he found himself in front of a paling, with some grotesque-looking figures carved in wood grinning above it, and within it a bamboo-leaf covered hut, before which stood a remarkably big ugly-looking blackamoor. Jack looked at him, and he looked at Jack, and uttered some words which clearly were meant to express, "Hillo, youngster, where are you hurrying to?" Jack followed a very natural impulse, which was to run as fast as he could. Under other circumstances this might have been a wise proceeding, for he certainly could run faster than the black man, who was not only big but fat. He had scarcely begun to run when a piece of painted wood came whizzing through the air after him, which would certainly have knocked him down had it hit him. He dodged it, however, but the next moment he heard the gruff voice of the black hounding on a dog, and when he turned his head he saw a huge Spanish bloodhound leaping over the paling, followed by the negro. To attempt to escape was now hopeless, so he ran forward, flourishing his stick in the hope of keeping the dog at bay. When the negro saw he was coming back, he called the hound off him. "For why you run so?" exclaimed the negro, who saw that he was an Englishman. "For the same reason that a pig does, because I was in a hurry," answered Jack, who saw that his best course was to put a good face on the matter. "Ah, you funny young ossifer, you laugh mooch," observed the negro. "Yes, it runs in the family, we are addicted to laughing," replied Jack with perfect coolness. "And now, old gentleman, I am very sharp set, and as I doubt not that you have plenty of provender in your house, I shall be much obliged to you for some supper." The negro evidently could not make out what Jack was about, and seemed to have an idea that he had run away from his ship. Jack was not sorry to encourage this. The black was evidently balancing in his mind whether he should make most by giving him up and claiming a reward, or helping him to hide and then getting possession of any wealth he might have about him. He in the most friendly way led Jack into his house. It was very neatly built of bamboo, of considerable size, oblong in shape, and divided into 4 or 5 rooms. In one was a table with some chairs, and the negro, having given some orders in a loud voice to several ebon-hued damsels who appeared at the door, in a short time several dishes of meat and grain were placed on it. "Come, you eat," said the host. Jack stuck his fork into the meat. It was not a hare, or a rabbit, or a pig, or a kid. He could not help thinking of his friend Quacko as he turned it over and over. However, he was very hungry, and he thought he would taste a bit. It was very tender and nice, so he resolved that he would not ask questions, but go on eating till his appetite was satisfied. There was a sort of porringer of farina, and some cakes of the same substance. He ate away, and felt much more satisfied than at first with the state of affairs. His host informed him that he was a grand pilot of the river, and showed him a variety of certificates which he had received to prove the fact, from the masters of English, American, Spanish, Portuguese, and French traders. Some praised him, but others remarked that he was one of the greatest rascals unhung, and that he would cheat and rob wherever he had the opportunity, and tell any falsehood to suit his purpose. A nice sort of gentleman, thought Jack, but he did not express his opinions, and tried to make himself as comfortable as he could. The negro placed wine and spirits before him, but he partook sparingly of them. "You say I good man," observed his host. "Go off to fight ship. Tell much. Ah," and he winked and nodded and turned his eyes about in a curious way. Jack concluded that he proposed going off to the ship, and would give some information about the slavers, and that he wanted him to vouch for his character. "All right," answered Jack. "You come on board. We shall be very happy to see you, and bring your book of certificates. Remember that." Considering the small vocabulary possessed by the negro, he managed to carry on a good deal of conversation with his guest. At last he made a sign that it was time to go to bed, and pointing to a bundle of mats, he told him to lie down, and that no harm would come to him. Jack did as he was bid, and having a good conscience and a good digestion, was very soon asleep. The household was astir by an early hour. When Jack opened his eyes, he saw that 2 or 3 strangers were in the room. They looked at him askance, with no friendly glance. His host soon after entered, and it was very evident that a change had come over the man's feelings towards him. Jack, however, got up, and, shaking himself, tried to look as unconcerned as possible. The bloodhound also, which had been very good friends with him the previous evening, walked in and stalked, snuffing and growling round and round him. Jack did not like the look of affairs. Some food at last was brought in for breakfast: baked yams, fried fish, farina, and other delicacies, of which his host invited him to partake, but was evidently inclined to treat him with very little ceremony. When the meal was over, Jack intimated that he should like to begin his journey to get on board his ship. The negro laughed and said something to the other men. "You no go dere now, you go with dese." Jack's countenance fell. The other blackamoors grinned, and without ceremony took him by the shoulder to lead him off. The midshipman's impulse was to resist, and he began to lay about him with his stick, which he snatched up from a corner, but the blacks threw themselves upon him, while the horrid bloodhound sprang at his legs, and in an instant he was overpowered, and his hands once more bound behind him. Jack thought that before he was carried off he would try and induce the big negro to help him, so he exclaimed, "I say, friend pilot, perhaps you can't help this, so just let them know on board ship where I am, and you will be well rewarded." He saw the negro grin, but before he could get an answer he was hurried off by his new masters. They conducted him along ground very similar to that which he had passed the previous day. Now and then he saw fields of Indian corn and small patches cultivated with other grains, but otherwise the country was covered mostly with a dense jungle, very narrow paths only being cut through it. After travelling 5 or 6 miles, they reached the river, and having dragged a canoe from among the bushes on the bank, all the party got into it and paddled away up the stream. The cords were by this time really hurting Jack's arms, and he made all the signs that he could think of to induce the negroes to remove them. To his great satisfaction, after talking together, one of them got up and slackened the knots, so that he could throw the rope off. He expressed his thanks to the negro, and placed it gently by his side. Scarcely had he done so, when his eye fell on a piece of board floating by. He stretched out his hand and got hold of it. That instant the idea flashed into his mind that this board might enable him to communicate with his shipmates. It very soon dried, and then, as if to amuse himself, he took out his knife and began cutting away at it. If he could carve but a few words, they might be sufficient to signify where he had gone. He carved, in no very regular characters, "A prisoner, up South Branch, Jack R." As soon as he had done this, pretending to be tired of the amusement, he threw the board into the stream and watched it floating down towards the sea. "It is 100 to 1 whether it is picked up," he said to himself with a sigh. "I'll double the chances, though." So he looked out for another board or piece of stick, and having before long got one, carved that in the same way. The blacks did not seem to suspect his object, and allowed him to continue the operation. After paddling about an hour, they ran up a small creek with black mud banks, and when they had drawn the canoe on shore, Jack found himself standing before a strong stockade or fort with a deep ditch around it. There was no gate on the side turned towards the river, but going round some way they arrived at the entrance over a rough drawbridge. The negroes talked a few minutes together, and then led Jack in. The object for which the fort was used was very clear. In the centre stood a large barracoon full of slaves. This barracoon was a shed built of heavy piles driven down into the earth, lashed together with bamboo, and thatched with palm leaves. Jack, as he passed, looked in. Sad was the spectacle which met his sight. The negroes who had charge of Jack did not appear to have found the person of whom they were in search, for after waiting some time they led him again out of the fort, and took the road up a hill away from the river. After walking some way they reached a village or town. It was surrounded by a bamboo fence. They entered by the narrow gateway at the end of the street. The houses, or rather huts, were all joined together, forming one long shed of uniform height on each side of the road. Each habitation had a small low door, which alone showed the number of separate dwellings in a row. The sides were composed of broad strips of bark, and bamboo leaves served for the thatch. Here and there were larger houses built of bamboo with raised floors, marking the residences of chief men. At last they had reached a house nearly 100 feet in length, and having ascended some steps, Jack found himself ushered into the presence of a burly negro, who was sitting in Oriental style on a pile of mats smoking a pipe. He had on a cocked hat, and a green uniform coat covered with gold lace, wide seaman's trousers and yellow slippers, a striped shirt, and a red sash around his waist. From his air he evidently considered himself a very important personage, and Jack did not doubt that he was in the presence of some Indian potentate. Round the room were several mirrors in gilt frames, and on a table stood a large silver bowl, while there was a couple of chairs and a sofa covered with damask or silk. The king, for so he called himself, looked at Jack sternly, and said, "For what you come to my country, eh?" Jack answered that he had been brought there against his will, and that he had no intention of coming. But his Majesty seemed to doubt him, and asked him a number of questions to elicit the truth. At length, however, he seemed satisfied. Jack was in hopes that he had made a favourable impression, and as he was getting hungry, he intimated that he should like some dinner. The king seemed pleased at the request, and ordered it to be brought into the room. It was a very good repast, and Jack was getting very happy, and hoping that there would be no great difficulty in making his escape, when the aspect of affairs was once more changed by the appearance of the two Spaniards who had picked him off the wreck of the slaver. They looked very fierce, and made threatening gestures at him, and abused him to the king for running away from them. And he discovered that they knew all about the expedition of the archers' boats up the river, and the capture of the schooner. He, however, went on eating his dinner, and tried to look unconcerned about the matter. This enraged them still more. What they might have done he could not tell. But suddenly a man rushed into the room, and gave some piece of information which seemed to put them all into a state of great agitation. They seized upon Jack and dragged him off, and they had a number of other people, headed by the king, rush down the bill towards the fort. From the few words dropped which Jack could comprehend, he understood that they expected an attack to be made on it for the purpose of rescuing the slaves, and that they were resolved to defend it to the last. He found himself dragged along till he was carried into the fort with the crowd. He was then shown a gun, and it was intimated to him that if he did not do his best to fight, he should forthwith have his brains blown out. A dreadful alternative, but from which he could discover not the slightest prospect of escaping. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ron Johnson. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 14. In the Negro Prison. Jack Rogers stood near the gun at which he had been placed in the slavers' fort. He had plenty of time to consider how he should act, but turn the matter over in his mind as much as he would, he could not arrive at a satisfactory decision. The alternatives left for his choice were to fire at his friends or to be shot himself. The slave traders and their assistants, and the slavers' crew who stood around him, were fellows whose very ill-looking countenances showed that they would not scruple to execute with very scant warning any threat they had made. An older man than Jack might have felt very uncomfortable under such circumstances. A more evil-disposed band of ruffians could not often have been collected together. They were of all colours, from those who called themselves white to negroes of the most ebon hue. Not that the whites had much claim to the distinction, for they were so bronzed by sun and wind that they were almost as dark as the Africans, and certainly they were not the least villainous-looking of the gang. Two of them especially, who had belonged to the crew of the schooner Jack had assisted to capture, seemed to have recognized him and paid him very particular and disagreeable attention. One of them politely handed him a rammer, and showed him how he was to load his gun, while the other put a pistol under his nose, and examining the perfect condition of the lock, explained with a mild smile that it was not at all likely to miss fire. Jack smelt at the pistol, and flourished the rammer. "Very good powder I have, no doubt," he remarked, looking as unconcerned as possible. "But I cannot say that I admire its odour. If any of you have a pinch of snuff to offer me now, I should be obliged to you. I want something to overcome the smell of the mud, which is anything but pleasant, let me assure you." The Spaniard, though he did not understand what Jack said, comprehended his signs, and thus appealed to could not resist pulling out his snuff box and offering it to him, though he fully intended, in case of any sign of insubordination, to blow out his brains at a moment's notice. Jack dipped his fingers into the snuff box with all the coolness and as great an air as he could command. He knew that his best chance of escape was to throw his captors off their guard. "Bueno, bueno," he remarked, scattering the snuff under his nose, as he had seen Spaniards do, for in reality he had no wish to take any up his nostrils. The slave traders could not help shrugging their shoulders, and thinking that they had got hold of a very independent sort of young gentleman. They talked together a good deal, and from what they said Jack made out that they were proposing to invite him to join them. "A very good joke," he thought to himself. "The rascals! I'll humour them in it. However, it will certainly afford me a better chance of escape." During this time a number of blacks were pouring into the fort, carrying all sorts of arms, most of them matchlocks of very antique construction, though some were muskets which had probably not long before left the workshops of Birmingham. Jack, hoping that he had thrown his captors a little off their guard, shouldered his rammer, and walked about to try and obtain a more perfect notion of the state of affairs. Looking through the stockades, he saw that the fort commanded entirely the reach of the river, at the extreme upper end of which it was situated. The stream there made a sudden bend, nearly doubling back on itself, and as the fort was placed almost on this point, the guns in it could fire point blank right down the stream. No boats had yet appeared, but from the look of intense eagerness exhibited on the countenances of all the blacks, he had no doubt that they were near at hand. The whole fort was in a great state of bustle, if not of confusion. The black warriors were running about here and there, chattering away to each other, and examining not only their own arms, but those of everybody else. Some of them Jack saw squinting down the barrels of their companions' muskets, to try and ascertain the cause apparently of their not going off, while the man at the other end would snap the lock without giving the slightest warning. One of them after this came up to Jack, and by signs and a few words of English, requested him politely to look into the muzzle of his musket and ascertain why it would not "fire bang," as he expressed it, intimating that he had already put in several charges. Jack declined that mode of proceeding, but begged to look at the other end. Jack burst into a fit of laughter. "The reason, amigo, is this: entiendes ustedes," he answered, as soon as he could find breath to speak. "There is no flint to your lock, and if there had been, the touch hole is well stopped up with rust. So you had two very secure preventives against it going off. I only hope that the rest of you have arms of a like character. Not much fear for my friends, then." He picked out the touch hole, however, for the negro, telling him that he must put a match into the pan when he wanted to fire it. He resolved, however, to stand clear of the negro when he fired it, for he had little doubt that when he did so the barrel would burst, and do much more damage to the defenders of the fort than to the assailants. Jack was in hopes that the guns mounted in the fort would prove to be in a similar condition, but on examining them he soon saw that they were ship's guns, and were in very good order. He had managed by his independent manner by this time to throw the slave dealers off their guard. He waited for an opportunity when they were not watching him, and then hurried back to the gun of which they had given him charge. As he could not manage to withdraw the shot, he knocked in a wedge, which gave it an elevation calculated to carry it far over the heads of any of the attacking party. He looked round when he had done this, to ascertain whether he had been observed, but the white men had turned round for some purpose, and the blacks did not seem to comprehend what he had been about. "At all events, I should not have to fire at my friends," he thought to himself, "and now the sooner they come on the better for me." Scarcely had these words passed through his mind than he observed a great commotion among the motley garrison of the fort, and looking through the embrasure at which his gun was placed, he caught sight of several boats just rounding the point at the other end of the reach. He could not make out who was the commander-in-chief of the present gang of villains with whom he was associated. The two Spaniards, who had at first paid him so much polite attention, were evidently not even officers. A huge black man with a very ugly visage seemed to have considerable authority. He was engaged in marshalling the negroes and posting them at the stockades ready to make use of their firearms. The burly sovereign of the territory was nowhere to be seen. He probably thought discretion the best part of valour, and had retired again to his capital to await the results of the contest. At last Jack's eyes fell on a little wizened old Spaniard in a straw hat, nankeen trousers, and a light blue coat, who, as soon as he made his appearance, began to order about everybody in an authoritative and energetic manner, and very quickly brought the confused rabble of defenders into order. 2 or 3 other Spaniards, who from their appearance seemed to be officers, came with him. He had evidently just arrived from a distance, summoned in a hurry, probably to defend the fort. He went round looking at the guns, and Jack was very much afraid that he would examine his. Just, however, as he was about to do so, up went a rocket high in the sky, let off probably as a signal for some purpose or other. It had the effect of calling off the old man's attention from him. The people in the advancing boats seemed not to have any notion that they were so near the fort, for they pulled on, without in any way quickening their speed, right up towards the guns. Jack had remarked the mode in which the place was fortified, so likely to lead strangers into a trap. In front of the stockade was a deep broad ditch, and then beyond it rose a low bank of soft slimy mud, held together by reeds and aquatic plants, and which sloped away again down to the river. This bank was covered at high water, but even then Jack doubted whether a boat could be got across it. The slave traders and blacks grinned as they thought of the trap into which the British seamen were about to fall. Jack watched the approach of the boats. Oh, how he longed to warn his friends of the danger threatening them. He would have shouted out to them, but they could not have heard him. And then he thought that he would climb up to the top of the stockade and warn them off. But he knew that the moment he was seen by the blacks to make any signal, a pistol bullet would be sent through his head. Jack was perfectly ready to run any risk for an adequate object, but after a moment's reflection he felt perfectly sure that the boats would come on notwithstanding anything he might do, and that the moment for sacrificing his life had not yet arrived. As the boats drew near, so did the flurry and excitement among the blacks increase. The white men looked along their guns and prepared for action. The little wizened old Spaniard posted himself in a position whence he could observe all that was going forward. Jack saw that he was watching him, and he also heard him tell one of the Spaniards, who had before paid him so much polite attention, to keep an eye on his movements. The old man probably had no great confidence in Jack's honesty of intentions. Luckily no one found what Jack had been about with the gun, or it would have fared ill with him. Jack cast many an anxious glance through the embrasure to catch the movements of the boats. There were a good many of them, that was one comfort. His friends were not so likely to be overpowered as he had first feared. Evidently another ship, or perhaps more, had joined the Archer and accompanied her boats up the river. He could not help also turning round to see what the old Spaniard was doing. There he stood on his perch surveying his motley crew, the impersonification of an evil spirit, so Jack thought. Yet he looked quite calm and quiet with a smile. It was not a pleasant one, however, playing on his countenance. In a moment afterwards his whole manner changed. He sprang off the ground and clapped his hands, crying out loudly, "Tira, tira, amigos! Fire, fire, my friends, and send all those Ingles to perdition!" He was under the belief that the boats had just come in a direct line with his guns, and that every shot would tell on them. The Spaniards and blacks were not slow to obey the order. Off went the guns, and the small armed men began peppering away till the whole fort was in a cloud of smoke. Jack delayed firing as long as he could, that he might be more certain that his shot would fly over the heads of his friends. He would have waited still longer had he not seen a Spaniard near him cocking his pistol and giving a very significant glance towards him. He had already begun to stoop down to fire, when a bullet whistled by his head, and he heard the sharp voice of the old Spaniard. "Take that, young traitor, if you don't choose to obey orders." Jack felt that he had had a narrow escape of his life. Looking along his gun, and seeing that the arc he believed the shot would make would extend far beyond the boats, he fired. He could not see where his shot went, for at that same moment the British, though at first not a little surprised at the warm reception they had encountered, had brought the guns in the bows of the boats to bear on the fort, and had opened a hot fire in return. With loud cheers they advanced, but Jack guessed that they had something in store which would astonish the blacks much more than the round shot, nor was he mistaken. Up flew, whizzing into the air, a shower of rockets, which came down quickly into the middle of the fort, and made both Spaniards and negroes scamper here and there at a great rate, knocking each other over, shrieking out oaths and prayers in a variety of dialects, and trying to hide themselves from their terrific pursuers. It was as if a number of wriggling serpents had been turned loose among a crowd of people. The old Spaniard stamped and swore with rage, calling the people back to their guns, abusing them, and firing his pistols right and left at them to bring them to order. Jack ran a great risk of being shot in the melee either by friends or foes. Oh, how he wished that the former knew the state of affairs inside the fort, and would make a dash at that moment and get into it. It was high tide, and the water covered the mud banks. The favourable moment was, however, lost, and by the fierce energy of the little old Spaniard, the defenders of the fort were driven back to their guns. Jack pretended to be very busy loading his. He had managed to get in a shot during the confusion, and one of the blacks next rammed in the powder and put another shot in after it. "All right, now blaze away, my hearty," he sang out. He had piled up a good quantity of powder over the touch hole, so there was an abundance of smoke, and the negro whom he addressed fully believed that the gun had gone off. "Now more powder and shot, old boy," cried Jack. "Ram away." Jack's gun was not likely to hurt his friends, but had the old Spaniard seen his tricks, he would very likely have had another bullet fired at him. Fortunately, the old fellow was too much engaged. The whole fort was full of smoke, and the defenders, having got over their first alarm at the rockets, were blazing away with all their might. Jack caught sight of the boats for an instant, separating on their hands so as to avoid the direct fire from the fort, and then he heard in another minute that true hearty British cheer, which has so often struck terror into the hearts of England's enemies. On either flank there came pouring into the fort a fresh flight of rockets, and almost the next instant Jack saw the boat's bows run stem on to the mud bank, which almost surrounded the fort. In vain the seamen endeavoured to shove the boats over it. They stuck fast. Jack shouted as loud as he could, in hopes that his voice might be heard, for he caught a glimpse of Alick Murray in one of the boats and Paddy Adair in another, using every effort to get up to the stockade. Perhaps they heard him, for he saw them leap overboard, followed by their men, with the intention clearly of wading up to the stockade, ignorant of course of the deep ditch between them and it. Jack felt sure that they would be shot down by the blacks if they made the attempt. He could restrain himself no longer, but ran towards them, shouting out, "Back, back! You can't get in that way!" Whether they heard him or not, he could not tell, for a heavy blow on the head was dealt him by the butt end of a pistol, the owner of which, one of his Spanish friends, would certainly have shot him had it been loaded, and he fell to the ground, stunned and helpless. How long he thus lay he could not tell. It could not have been for any length of time, for the battle was still raging when he came to his senses. He instantly crawled to one of the embrasures and looked out. The English had suffered severely, and one boat lay on the mud disabled, and the dead bodies of several men strewed the mud bank, which the falling tide had left dry. Then he turned his head, for he heard loud cheers and shouts and cries and howls on one side of the fort. A fresh attack, he suspected, had just been made. It was resisted with all the desperation of despair by most of the Spaniards and many of the blacks. The British were forcing their way in. He caught sight of the heads of the seamen surmounting the stockade, and then he saw that it was Alick Murray leading them on. The spectacle gave him fresh life. He jumped on his legs and gave a loud "Huzzah!" He had better have been silent. The old Spaniard, who had been flying about in every direction with the most wonderful activity, encouraging the people, pointing the guns, and showing himself the leading spirit of the gang, caught sight of him. It had now become evident that the fort would be taken. There was but one outlet by which the gang could escape. The ruffians began to give way. Numbers were wounded. Many lay dead on the ground. Several of the fugitives passed him. He was hoping that the moment of his deliverance was at hand, when he felt his shoulder grasped by the little old Spaniard, and found himself dragged along by a power he could not resist. He struggled, but struggled in vain. Small as the old man was, he was all sinew and muscle. His clutch was like that of a vice. There was a fierce rush. Blacks, Spaniards, and mulattoes were all mingled together, and good reason they had to run, for at their heels came fast a body of English seamen, slashing away with their cutlasses and firing their pistols. Hemming, Murray, and Adair were leading them, and Jack recognized some of the officers of his own ship, the Ranger. He now knew how it was. The expedition had been strengthened. He sought to escape from his captor. "If you shout, I'll shoot you," said the old man in English, grinning horribly. He was in hopes his old schoolfellows would have recognized him. Back he was hurried. Still he felt sure that his friends would overtake him. The retreating villains had got close to the barricade, and not far from the last entrance to the fort. The seamen pressed on. There was still some space between the parties, when the old man fired his pistol into a cask sunk into the ground. A thick smoke came out of it. Back the pirates pushed. In an instant more, a dense mass rose before them of earth and stone, and timbers horribly mingled with the arms and legs and bodies of human beings. A mine had been sprung. Jack was in an agony of fear for the fate of his friends. He could see nothing of them. He observed only that the mine had taken effect under one end of the barracoon. The terrible shrieks and cries of its wretched inmates rang in his ears. A number of them had been liberated, and with loud yells were following in the rear of the slave dealers, for whom they served as an effective shield against the shot of the seamen. The slaves had been told that the English would kill them, so they ran away as soon as they were let out of the barracoon as fast as the rest. The piratical crew, for such they really were, took their way up the hill towards the king's residence, followed closely by the slaves and all the rabble who had escaped out of the fort. Jack expected that his friends would have been pursued, and should he escape the pistol of the old gentleman who had him by the arm, he hoped before long to be rescued. They had not, however, got far up the hill when he saw flames burst forth from the barracoon, in which he knew, judging from those following, that a number of poor wretches had been left in chains, and he truly guessed that his countrymen were stopping to try and rescue them. The flames burst fiercely and blazed up high, as they caught the dry inflammable timber of which the building was composed. Nothing could arrest their progress. The gallant seamen, he knew, would be dashing in among them in spite of the hot smoke, and doing their best to rescue the unfortunate wretches, but he feared that few would be saved. Even where he was he could hear their piteous shrieks, as the flames caught hold of them, chained as they were and unable to escape. As was too likely, the pirates had set fire to the barracoon on purpose to delay the English. This plan succeeded perfectly. Often the same sort of thing has been done at sea, and when a slaver has been hard pressed, blacks have been thrown overboard by the crew to induce the English cruiser to stop and pick them up, and thus enable them to escape. Jack was dragged away up the hill, through the gateway of the town, and into the king's palace. That worthy was seated where Jack had first seen him, and employed much in the same way, smoking a pipe. "Why have you brought him?" inquired his sable majesty of the little old Spaniard, whom Jack heard addressed as Don Diogo. "He will serve as a hostage. They have got some of our people," was the answer. "But will they give us back any of the slaves?" asked the king. "Not one, whatever we may threaten," replied the Don, grinding his teeth. "They would not have got many, that is one comfort. A considerable number came with us, and most of those who were unable to set loose have been burnt. Our enemies have not gained much by their victory in any way, for we killed a good many of them and destroyed some of their boats. We have had a desperate fight of it, though." "It may be as well, then, not to kill the youngster, though it might be a satisfaction to you," said the king, looking at the Don. "Not for the present," said Don Diogo. "We will keep him for a short time, and see how high his friends value him. If they refuse to give enough in exchange for him, as he can be of no use here, we can then shoot him." Jack, of course, could not understand all this conversation, but he made out enough to comprehend its tenor, which was certainly not of a character to enliven him. After a little while he found himself hauled out of the king's presence and thrust into a small hut by himself. A black, with a brace of pistols in his belt, and a musket which looked as if it would go off, was placed sentry over him. He either would not, or probably could not, reply to any of the questions Jack put to him whenever he thrust his head in at the door, apparently to ascertain that his prisoner was all safe. Thus passed the day. Towards the evening Jack began to be very hungry and very sick, and to wonder whether he was to be starved to death. He pointed to his mouth and made every sign he could think of to show that he was hungry, but the sentry appeared to take no notice of him. At last, however, another man opened the door and placed a bowl of farina before him. It was not very dainty fare, but he was too sharp set to be particular, and so set to on it at once and gobbled away till he had finished it. He was wondering whether he should have to sleep on the bare ground, when the same man appeared with a bundle of Indian corn and other leaves, and threw them down in the corner, making a sign that they were to serve him as his bed. "Thank you, old fellow. I might go farther and fare worse." His spirits rose somewhat, for he judged rightly that his captors would not take so much trouble about him had they intended to murder him. He did not forget how mercifully his life had been preserved during the day, and he offered up his thanks on high before he threw himself on his bed of leaves to go to sleep. He slept as soundly as a top all night, and when he awoke he could scarcely remember what had occurred during the previous day. Before long his former attendant appeared and placed another bowl of farina before him. "If they were cannibals, I might have some suspicion of their intentions," he said to himself. "They don't propose to eat me, but I know that I shall grow enormously fat if I go on ramming down such stuff as this." However, as he was very hungry, he did swallow the whole of it. Hours passed away. No one else came near him. He fully expected to find the town attacked by the English, and waited impatiently to hear the sounds of the commencement of the strife. But except that occasionally he heard tom-toms beating at a distance, and a few shots fired, everything in the town was quiet. It was some time in the afternoon when two armed blacks appeared and marched Jack out of his prison up to the king's palace. The king scarcely took any notice of him as he entered the reception room. Soon after Don Diogo appeared. "Will they give up the slaves?" asked the king. "Not a bit of it," answered Don Diogo. "They say that if we kill that lad, then they will kill 6 times as many people of ours." "That can't be helped," observed the king. "The people were born to be killed." "Certainly," answered Don Diogo, "but there are some Spaniards among them, and I require their services." "But is it not possible that they may come and burn my town? I have no wish for that to happen, even for your sake, my friend," said the king. "Shoot the midshipmen if they do," answered Don Diogo, turning a not very pleasant glance at Jack. "At present, however, they do not seem disposed to attack us. We have given them enough to attend to for the present. We killed a good number, and the boats have gone back with the wounded and prisoners. Then the young jackanapes of an office may be shut up in prison again," said the king. Scarcely had the order been given when a Spaniard rushed with fierce gestures into the room. "Those English have killed some of our friends, and we are resolved to have our revenge," he exclaimed, looking savagely at Jack and handling his long knife. "Don't kill him yet, though," said Don Diogo with his usual coolness. "It will be time enough when he is of no further use. Take him away now." These were not exactly the words Jack heard used, but he made out that such was their tenor. Poor Jack! He was thrust rudely back into the dark, dirty hut, and the only food he received was a bowl of the ill-dressed farina, of which he was getting heartily tired. His spirits began to fall lower than they had ever before done. He saw no hope of escape, for he was certain that should the English threaten to attack the town, that instant he would be put to death, even should he escape the long knives of some of the Spaniards who had evidently a hankering for his blood. At last he fell asleep. Midshipmen have a knack of sleeping under the most adverse circumstances. His powers in that way were very considerable. It was daylight when he awoke, but there were no sounds to indicate that the negro population was astir. He could not help fancying that some attempt would be made by Captain Lascelles and Captain Grant to rescue him. But the day passed on, and no one except the man who brought him his insipid farina came near him. If he had any mode in which to employ himself, he could, he thought, have the better borne his imprisonment and the dreadful state of suspense in which he was placed. All he could do was walk about or sit on his bed of leaves with his head resting on his knees. Now and then, as the evening approached and his weariness increased, he jumped up and thought that he would force his way out and make a run for it. But then the feeling that he would most certainly be killed if he made the attempt, besides recollecting not knowing where he should run to, induced him to sit down again and chew the cud of impatience. Night came again. He was more melancholy than ever. He thought that he was deserted, or that probably his friends fancied he was killed, and would not trouble themselves further about him. He had no inclination to sleep even after it grew dark. He listened to the various noises in the village, or rather city it should be called. They amused him somewhat. The odd tones of the negroes' voices, the shouts, the laughter, the cries of babies, the barking curs, the beating of tom-toms. At last, however, even they ceased, and he dozed away till he forgot where he was and everything that had happened. How long he had slept he could not tell, or rather, had he been asked, he would have asserted that he had not been asleep at all, when he opened his eyes and saw by the light of the moon, which shone through a hole in the roof, the round face of a black boy looking down upon him with a friendly and compassionate expression. End of chapter 14. Recording by Ron Johnson.
Chapter 15 of The Three Midshipmen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Three Midshipmen by William Henry Giles Kingston. Chapter 15. In Search of Jack. 3 of the Archer's boats were manned and under the command of Lieutenant Hemming, Murray having charge of one and Adair of the other. We were about to shove off and proceed up the river to search for their missing shipmates, when a sail was seen from the masthead, standing down toward them. She was quickly made out to be a large ship, and in a short time little doubt remained that she was an English frigate. Captain Grant therefore ordered the boats to delay their departure, that a more powerful expedition might be forthwith dispatched to compete with any enemies with whom they might fall in. "Hurrah! She's our own ship, the Ranger!" exclaimed Adair, who had gone aloft to have a look at the stranger, and now came below to make his report to Hemming. "Captain Lascelles is just the man to back up Captain Grant. If he knows any barracoons or slavers, strongholds of any description, he will be for going in and blowing them all up without a moment's delay." To prove that Adair was right, the Ranger soon after made her number, and at the same time another sail appeared to the northward. She turned out to be a brig of war, the Wasp. Captain Grant immediately went on board the frigate. Captain Lascelles entered fully into his plan, and instead of 3, as soon as Wasp came up, fortunately 10 boats started on the expedition. Hemming was much gratified when Captain Lascelles declined to supersede him, assuring him that no one was better qualified to be entrusted with the command. There is always something very exciting in an expedition, no matter what the object, but when there is some uncertainty and danger, and a prospect of fighting, everybody gets into the highest possible spirits. Murray and Adair would have been in high spirits also had they not been anxious about Jack. Not that they were very unhappy. They had all so often missed each other and been in difficulties and dangers that they thought he would turn up somewhere before long. The boats dashed over the bar and pulled up to the south branch. As it was flood tide, they made rapid progress. They had gone some way up when they saw someone on the bank of the river beckoning them. "A mere naked nigger," said Adair, looking through his glass. "Not worth waiting for him, I should think." Hemming seemed to be of the same opinion, for the boats continued their progress. Seeing this, the negro set off running as fast as he could go, and was soon lost to sight in the jungle. Not long after they came to the end of a reach. Then it appeared that the river doubled back, as it were, on itself. "Hillo, there's something in the water ahead of us," sang out Adair to Murray. "It's a negro swimming off to us. Do you see him, sir?" said Murray to Hemming, whose boat was near his. The negro lifted up his hand as if trying to make a signal to them, and wishing to be taken on to one of the boats. Hemming told Murray to pull towards the negro and ascertain what he wanted. In a few minutes Murray had hauled the young negro lad into his boat. "What does you want, my lad?" asked Alick in his usual kind way. The poor negro evidently wanted to speak, but could not find English words enough to express himself, though he was very voluble when employing his own language. No sooner, however, had Murray returned to the line of boats and retaking his place near Hemming, than the black lad's countenance brightened up. "Ah, Massa Hemming, Massa Hemming!" he exclaimed, trying to spring into the lieutenant's boat. He would, in his eagerness, have jumped overboard had not some of the seamen held him back. "He seems to know you, sir," said Murray. Is me no Massa Hemming, is kind Massa," exclaimed the young negro, eagerly catching the words. "Let him come into my boat, and I'll hear what he's got to say," said Hemming, greatly to the delight of the negro, who clearly understood him. No sooner was the black lad on board Hemming's boat than he seized his hand and kissed it, and showed every mark of affection. Then, with evident eagerness and haste, he made all sorts of signs, aiding them by such few words as he knew. "Man come, bad, no, no," he said, pointing up the river. Hemming understood that someone would come and try and mislead them, and that they were not to trust him. Then Hemming tried to ascertain the fate of the missing boat's crew. His heart sank when the negro explained by signs that he could not mistake that they had all been murdered. "No one escaped?" he asked. The negro shook his head. No, not one survived. It appeared Murray and Adair were soon made acquainted with the information, and then indeed they began to fear that Jack Rogers, their gallant, jovial companion, was lost to them for ever. Grief and indignation, and a desire to punish the perpetrators of the deed, took possession of their hearts. That was but natural. It is difficult to distinguish between revenge, which is wrong, and a desire to punish evil doers, when we ourselves are affected by their misdeeds. The young negro, after talking away and making signs to Hemming for some time longer, desired to be put on shore. Murray was ordered to convey him there. Good man, Massa Hemming," he kept saying all the time. "Take care, bad man come off shore." As soon as he landed, off he darted again through the mangrove bushes, and was lost to sight. "He seems to be an old friend of yours, sir," observed Murray when he got back. "Yes, I find that he is a lad I once, when he was a young boy, jumped overboard to save in the West Indies after he had been taken out of a slaver," answered Hemming carelessly. "He made me out when we were in the river before taking the Spanish schooner. He has ever since been watching for an opportunity to speak to me. I cannot make out exactly what he wishes to guard us against. Some treachery, I conclude. I could not fancy that he would have recollected me so long. It shows that blacks have grateful hearts." Hemming sympathised much with Murray and Adair, for he knew of their attachment to Jack, and he fully believed that he had been lost with the rest. Bitter and sad were their feelings. "Oh, Jack, Jack," muttered Adair in a tone of grief, "are you really gone?" The flotilla of boats proceeded some way further, when a large canoe was seen paddling out towards them from the shore. A burly negro sat in the stern and made a profound salaam with his palm leaf hat as he approached. "Me first piloted this river," he shouted with a stentorian voice. "Take me board. Come, show me way." Hemming ordered his crew to cease rowing, and took him into his boat to hear what he had got to say for himself. He had, however, exhausted nearly all his vocabulary in his first address, and there was some difficulty in understanding him. In vain Hemming tried to gain some information about the missing boat and her crew. The negro either knew nothing or was resolved not to tell. At last he produced a book of certificates. When Hemming had glanced over them, he burst into a fit of laughter and handed them back. The big negro looked exceedingly indignant, and striking his breast, repeated vehemently, "Me good man, me show way." Many of the certificates had been far from complimentary to the negro, but still Hemming thought that he might be useful as a pilot, till he recollected the warning he had just received. "This undoubtedly the very fellow I was to expect," he said to himself. "No, no, you go on shore. We can do without you," he exclaimed, addressing the negro. The burly savage blustered and protested, but he was made to step into his canoe, which had been paddling alongside, and Hemming signified to him clearly that he must take himself off. They then observed him watching them for some way. Then he hauled up his canoe, and taking a path inland, they saw no more of him. They had pulled on for half an hour or more when Murray caught sight of a board floating in the water. He could scarcely account for the impulse which made him steer towards it and pick it up. His eye brightened as he looked at it. "Hurrah!" he shouted joyfully. "Hurrah! Jack Rogers is alive. Here is a note from him. There's no doubt about it. It is short, though. It says, 'A prisoner up South Branch, Jack R.'" The shout was taken up by his own crew and the crews of all the other boats, and the banks of the stream rang with their loud hurrahs. This brief notice instigated all hands to make still greater exertion and to try and recover Jack wherever he might be. On they went. Reach after reach of the winding river was passed, and they had got a long way up, higher than any of them had ever been before, when a shot, seeming as if it came out of the bank, flew over their heads. Another and another followed. "We are just in front of the pirates' battery," exclaimed Hemming. "On, lads, on! We'll storm it without delay." The seamen required no further encouragement. A shower of rockets was first fired into the enemy's fort. Then on they dashed, in spite of the heavy fire of musketry, as well as of grape shot and langrage, which was opened on them in return. To their rage and disappointment, the boats stuck on the mud bank just outside the stockades, which they only then discovered. Many of the seamen leapt out of the boats and attempted to wade onwards, but they either at once sank into the mud or fell forward into the deep ditch, where several were shot down before they could be rescued by their comrades, while others were drowned or smothered in the mud. It was horrible work. An enemy whom they despised was close to them, and yet they could not be got at. Hemming, his heart burning with anger and grief at the loss of so many poor fellows, and the almost hopelessness of success, ordered the boats to shove off, with the intention of making an attack on some other part of the fort. The blacks continued firing away under the cover without much fear of being hit in return. It was melancholy to have to retire and to see the bank, from off which the water had begun to recede, strewed with the bodies of those who, a few minutes before, were as full of life and energy as themselves. Before getting to any great distance, Murray thought he saw a channel to the right, which must run near the fort. He pointed it out to Hemming, who told him to lead the way. He was right. The negroes had neglected to fortify it, and in a few seconds the boats were close up to the stockades. Not a moment was lost in storming them and hauling them down. In rushed the gallant bluejackets, led on by Hemming, Murray, and Adair, and other officers, and at length they got their black enemy face to face. "There's Rogers! There's Rogers!" shouted Murray and Adair, for they both saw him at the same time. They were certain of it, though his features were considerably begrimed with powder, smoke, and dirt. This was incentive enough to make them push on with still greater haste, had they not been eager to punish the abominable slave dealers and their crew of ruffians. The brave fellows little knew the terrible trap prepared for them. Murray and Adair had sprung on ahead, and believed that in another minute they would have rescued Jack from the grasp of his captors, when they felt themselves suddenly pulled back by Hemming and Will Needham. "Back, back, lads, back!" sang out the lieutenant. At that moment up ascended right before them a mass of earth and stones and wood, with a dense cloud of smoke and dust, accompanied by a terrific roar, and they felt themselves lifted off their feet and sent heels over head, while down upon them came showering all the more solid portions of the above-mentioned materials about their ears, as they lay half stunned and stifled and vainly endeavouring to rise. Another foot in advance and they had been blown up to destruction. Hemming had seen the old Spaniard fire his pistol into the tub and guessed what was coming. Murray and Adair felt themselves very much hurt. So indeed were Hemming and Needham, while several poor fellows were maimed or killed outright. The two schoolfellows, after lying stupefied for a few seconds, lifted up their heads and began to crawl out from the mass of ruins which surrounded them. "Where's Jack?" exclaimed Murray. "Where's Jack?" cried Adair, getting upon his legs and helping Murray, who was more hurt than he was. They were the first words they uttered. He had not been out of their thoughts in spite of the dreadful commotion. As the smoke cleared away, they caught sight of a group of fugitives, among whom they supposed he was, ascending the hill which rose beyond the fort. They were eager to pursue, but when they looked round and saw so many of their companions disabled, and Lieutenant Hemming himself on the ground, they could not help fearing that pursuit would be hopeless. Still, they were moving on, when Hemming, recovering himself, called them back. "It's of no use, lads," he cried. "The scoundrels have escaped us this time. See too, we have work here." As he spoke, flames burst forth out of the barracoon, part of which had been blown up by the mine. The seamen, who could stand wounded or not, rushed forward, led by their officers, to help the miserable slaves. They hacked away desperately to get them free of their manacles, trying to cut through the solid iron or the beams to which the chains were secured. Meantime the hot flames were raging around them, and almost prevented them from performing their work of mercy. Still, in spite of the fire, the heat, and the smoke, and the possibility of being again blown up, the undaunted fellows laboured on. Numbers of the poor slaves had been liberated, and several children had been carried off who would otherwise have been left with their mothers to perish. But at last the terrific element gained the upper hand. The seamen's clothes were literally scorched off their backs before they would quit the work of humanity on which they were engaged. But even they were at last obliged to retreat, leaving the miserable captives to their fate. Again and again, however, now one, now another, would make a dash in among the flames, and try to haul out some poor burning creature whose imploring cries their tender heart could not withstand. One gallant fellow was killed by the falling of a burning beam before they would desist altogether from their brave efforts. By this time the retreating slave traders had got completely out of sight, and when Lieutenant Hemming looked round and saw the number of men he had lost, and the disabled state of some of his boats and of so many of his followers, he felt that he could in no way be justified in attempting to continue the pursuit. An officer often shows his bravery and fitness to command as much by his discretion and holding back as by pushing forward. Hemming was just one of these men. If he thought a thing ought to be done, he did not stop to consider what others would say about it. He did it. He now ordered his party to collect, and having conveyed some of the lighter guns to the boats, and spiked and turned the others over into the mud, and set fire to what would burn in the fort, he ordered all hands to make preparations for embarking with the rescued slaves, as well as with 4 Spaniards, 3 of whom were wounded, and several negroes who had been captured. He had formed a plan which he hoped to carry out. Some time, however, was occupied in repairing 2 of the boats. One was so completely destroyed that he could not carry her off. Before all these arrangements were concluded and the party were prepared to embark, it was late in the day. Hemming wanted, by a show of retreating, to throw the slave dealers and negroes off their guard, and then to make a sudden dash up the stream and come upon them unawares. Having previously sent down the river to the ship some of the boats with the captured slaves, the rest of the officers agreed to the plan as soon as he propounded it to them, and Murray and Adair were consoled at the thought of soon being able to return and attempt Jack's rescue. The state, however, of his wounded men, and the difficulty of navigating the river in the dark, compelled Hemming to bring up sooner than he had intended. A spot of high ground near the river, which he thought might be easily defended, induced him to land. Some bamboos and young trees were cut down to form a stockade, fires were lighted, sails were spread to form tents, and every preparation was made for passing the night. "I only wish that Jack was here. He would enjoy this," observed Paddy to Alick. "I say, by hook or by crook we must get him out of the hands of these ruffians. I've been turning the matter over in my mind, and I am resolved, if Mr. Hemming does not think fit to go back and try and rescue Jack, that I will make the attempt myself. I could very soon black myself all over, and a nigger's costume will not take long to extemporise. I would soon frizzle up my hair, and with an old palm leaf hat on top of it, and my shirt with the tails hanging down, and tied round the waist by a piece of rope yarn, I should look every inch of me a blackamoor. Capital, observed Murray. I'll accompany you if we find better measures fail, but I still fear we should run a great risk of being discovered by the blacks. Not a bit of it, answered Adair. The very daring of the thing would throw them off their guard. They would never expect that two white people could so speedily turn themselves into niggers. Of course we must pretend to be dumb, though we can talk first-rate nigger gibberish in the berth. It won't pass current, I fear, among the natives of these parts. Not very likely, however. Your idea of pretending to be dumb is good. I think I'd better pretend to be an idiot, answered Murray. But the question is, who will they take us for? Where do you fancy they think we will have come from? My idea is that we should rather try and find where Jack is, without falling foul of any of the natives. I want to set off directly it is dark, clamber up the hill where we saw him last, and cut him out. It is to be done, I am certain, and Jack is well worth all the risk we should have to run. That he is, exclaimed Adair warmly. There's nothing I wouldn't do for him, and I'm sure he would do anything for us. The subject was fully discussed, and then the midshipmen went to Hemming and asked leave to put their plan into execution. Hemming might on another occasion have been inclined to laugh at the proposal, but he was too anxious to get Jack out of the slaver's power, for he felt his hands tied somewhat with a fear of what the blacks might do to the midshipmen should he attack their town. He was, therefore, ready to try any plan, however desperate, to recover Rogers. Having obtained the leave they wanted to put their plan into execution, Murray and Adair set to work to devise the details, as they could only hope to carry out their schemes at night. They agreed that they need not be very particular as to the correctness of their masquerade. There was no time to get any dye, but burnt cork well rubbed in with oil they agreed would answer the purpose. It was too late, however, to take any active steps that night. It was settled that the next morning the flotilla, with some parade, should proceed down the river, while they, with Dick Needham and a picked crew, should lie hid in the smallest boat until dusk the next evening. Then they were to land and to try and find out where Jack was. Once discovering the locality of his prison, they fully believed that they could, as they called it, cut him out as easily as many a rich Spanish galleon has in days of yore been cut out from an enemy's fort, even though protected by the guns of the fort. The night passed away quietly. The party had expected an attack from the slave dealers, but these gentry had received a sufficient notice of the warm reception they were likely to encounter, not to make the attempt. In the naming, however, Murray, who had a lookout while the rest were preparing to strike their tents, observed a party approaching with a white flag. He reported what he had seen to Lieutenant Hemming. "The impudent scoundrels," he proclaimed. "No flag of truce ought to shelter them. However, while poor Rogers is in their power, we must treat them as best we can." The party soon arrived at the temporary encampment. The most prominent person was the burly negro who had introduced himself down the river as a pilot, and there was a Spaniard and several blacks. The big negro was spokesman, as he professed to know more English than any of the rest. Hemming received them in a very haughty way. "What do you want? Have you come to excuse yourselves for firing on my boats and killing my people?" he asked in a stern voice. It was difficult to understand exactly what the negro said in return, but Hemming made out that he knew nothing about firing on the boats, as he had not been at the fort, but that he had been sent by the king of the country to demand back some prisoners who had been taken while defending the territories of the said king against an unlawful attack made on them by the English boats. Also there were some Spanish cavaliers, his honoured allies, who must be likewise restored to liberty. There were some slaves, too, who must be given up, or the king would visit the English with his intense displeasure. The long rigmarole of a speech, of which this was the substance, would have made Hemming laugh on any other occasion. However, now he merely replied, "Listen, tell the king, or whatever he calls himself, that the English are here to punish evildoers, to set slaves at liberty, to put a stop to the slave trade, to encourage commerce, and to prevent wars. If people we have caught are found to be pirates, as such they will be hung. We keep no terms with people who, like him, support piracy and the slave trade." Hemming said something more to the same effect. The negro, however, had a last card to play, which he fancied would win the game. "Ah, then, if you kill our people, the king says he will kill a little officer we have of yours. His life may not be worth much, but he shall die." The negro grinned horribly as he said this. "If he does," exclaimed Hemming furiously, "tell the king that we will never rest till we have pulled him off his throne and his town about his ears, and burnt up all his country. Now you've got my answer. Go." Hemming wisely would not condescend to say another word after this. He knew pretty well how to treat such barbarians. The sable ambassador in his motley suit, finding that nothing more was to be got out of the English officer, took his departure. Scarcely had he gone when a figure was seen to creep out from among some bushes in the neighbourhood. It proved to be the negro lad who had warned them of the black pilot's intended treachery. He ran forward and threw himself at Hemming's feet, showing every sign of delight at finding him again. Hemming at once thought of asking him about Jack, the very thing it proved he had come about. He had heard of him, and had gone and discovered where he was shut up, and understood that his captors talked of killing him should any harm befall their people who had been taken prisoners. Hemming felt sure that he might be fully trusted. So did Murray and Adair. They therefore explained their plan to him and asked him to assist them. This he at once joyfully undertook to do. Very little change in their plan was necessary. He agreed to act as their guide. They were to assume the character of slave boys belonging to a distant tribe who he was conducting to his uncle, a chief of some influence in the country, and was secretly favourable to the English. Wasser, the negro lad, assured them he was very glad they had not ventured to make any attempt by themselves, as their detection would have been almost certain. Hemming delayed as long as he could before embarking, and he promised to wait for Murray and Adair some way down the river while they went on their expedition. Their boat, with Dick Needham, their new friend Wasser, and 3 other picked men, all well armed, shoved off with the other boats, and soon darting it towards a sheltered nook which they had before observed, lay, as they believed, perfectly concealed from all passers-by. Wasser, however, advised them to cut down boughs and to fasten them in front of the boat. This they did, and, as Paddy observed, they could not desire to pass the day in a pleasanter way than in a shady bower, with nothing to do and plenty to eat.
End of chapter 15.